"Why do you have a photo of me?" the billionaire demanded. The poor girl's answer was the last thing he expected, and it was the beginning of a secret that would rip open a past he thought he had buried. If you love real-life stories, suspense-driven stories, subscribe now. You won't want to miss what happens next. The lot had a name only in municipal paperwork: Parcel 47. To most people, it was simply the place things went to die, the unofficial city dump where stray dogs nested in mounds of decay and wind carried the hollow clink of broken glass across the afternoon. To Alexander Hayes, it was a project, an ugly problem with margins, a challenge he could engineer into profit and prestige. He arrived in a black car that smelled faintly of leather and ozone, stepping out with a folder of blueprints tucked under his arm and a practiced expression that had closed more deals than salesmen could count. At 38, Alexander had built a reputation on two things: precision and distance. He ran Hayes Development the same way he ran his life: efficient, controlled, and without sentiment. Friends called him driven. Rivals called him cold. He had little patience for distraction. He wore his success like armor: tailored suits, an office that swallowed sunlight, and a life measured in quarterly returns. His project manager, Mark Bennett, walked beside him wearing a hard hat and a pair of eyes that had learned to read Alexander like code. "We'll need to clear the eastern quadrant first," Mark said, gesturing toward a slope of rubbish where plastic and concrete merged into a makeshift cliff. "We've got teams lined up for Monday. With your sign-off, we can start demolition next week." Alexander nodded, but his attention drifted. There was a sound under the ordinary, a soft shuffle, a pause that didn't belong to construction or wind. He frowned and stepped away from the small circle of men inspecting the plans, moving toward a tangle of broken playground equipment where the sunlight hit in narrow strips. She stepped out from behind a dented slide as if the world had handed her forward. A child, no older than 7, wore a dress that had once been bright and was now the color of dust. Her hair clung to her scalp in thirsty ropes. Dirt mapped the hollows of her cheeks. In one small, stubborn fist she carried a photograph, crumpled at the edges and black and white in a world of color. When she looked up, the sunlight caught in her eyes the way it does in old photographs, holding something past and small and true. She blinked as though seeing the future for the first time. Alexander's movement slowed as memory did something peculiar and dangerous. It unlatched. The face in the photograph she held was him, years younger, without the constant tension at the jaw he wore now. He had not seen that old photograph in more than a decade. He had not expected anyone to have kept it. He had certainly not expected a child to clutch it like a relic. "Hey!" Mark said, a touch too sharp behind him. "Who is she?" The girl's voice was a fragile thing. "I'm looking for Daddy," she said, and the words collided in the empty lot like a thrown stone into water. For a fraction of a second, Alexander did what he always did when decisions were required. He cataloged variables. A child alone at a dump site, liability, headline potential, complication. But then the photograph slid from memory into a different place. A private drawer he had thought long sealed. A face from a life he had folded away with careful hands. A past that, if examined, might crumble every polished surface he had built. He stepped forward with a politeness that felt foreign. "This is not a place for kids," he said, voice even. "Where did you come from?" She pressed the photograph to her chest like a talisman. "He told me I would find you," she whispered. "He said you'd come." The name, the pronoun, flickered through him like a live wire. He felt the world tilt. The men around him were suddenly very far away. He recognized her eyes in a way that startled him. The same stubborn set he had seen in a woman many summers ago, in a small apartment that smelled of boiled coffee and second-hand books. He had closed that door years ago by choice, with rational explanations, with the heavy currency of a life that required his absence. His mind, trained to avoid softness, betrayed him with a memory of a promise he had never meant to make. "Show me the picture," he said before he could stop himself. She obeyed with small hands, offering a corner first, then the whole photograph. He took it as if accepting a confession. In the image he saw himself younger and less guarded, sitting on a low stoop and looking almost like a man who might one day be soft enough to stay. The ink had faded, but his eyes were unmistakable. "Who gave you this?" he asked softly. The girl straightened as if the question were a rope she could cling to. "Mama gave it to me," she said. "She said you'd find me." A dozen logical thoughts tried to reassert themselves. There are scams. There are mistakes. There are people who use lonely children as tools. There are explanations you could build into a memo and a morning meeting. But then the girl's knees buckled. It was sudden and small and terrifyingly human. A spasm, a fainting, the sort of collapse that makes time awkwardly elastic. One heartbeat she stood. The next she was falling, and Alexander's body moved on a command it had never needed before. He caught her under the shoulders and lowered her to the dust, ignoring the burn in his palms. "Call an ambulance," he barked to Mark, and bark he did. Not because of public image or legal risk, but because a part of him existed now that cataloged nothing but the immediate and the personal. Mark, who had managed bids and deadlines with less drama, was the first to react, shouting for help while others gathered. The child's breath was shallow. The photograph slipped from her fingers and fluttered into the dirt. Alexander found himself moving to pick it up, as if retrieving the past could steady the present. He cradled the girl's small face in one hand, feeling the fine grain of dust on her cheek, a trickle of something warm, sweat, perhaps, or the thin tearing of panic, ticked down his wrist. "Stay with me," he said absurdly, like a bedside prayer. "Stay with me, Lily." The name formed, unbidden and certain. He had never told anyone that name mattered to him. He didn't know why the vowels lined up with the weight of his heart. But the child's eyelids fluttered weakly at the sound, a feather against the air. The ambulance arrived with a pace that felt slower than a siren should allow. Lights blinked, men moved with clinical efficiency, and through it all Alexander sat on the damp ground with a child in his arms, a businessman who measured risk in profit margins now reduced to counting breaths. At the hospital, under the stark light of the emergency room, a nurse named Sarah, Dr. Sarah Monroe, who later introduced herself with a voice used to both grief and hope, read the signs and said the words he feared to hear. Severe dehydration, exposure, possible malnutrition. They ran tests. They took notes. Alexander's phone buzzed with messages that he ignored like static. When the child at last opened her eyes, they were glassy and confused. She mouthed something that made the air in the fluorescent room still. "Daddy?" The monitors that registered numbers and vitals could not measure the silent collapse and rearrangement happening inside Alexander Hayes. A sound came from his chest that felt like an apology and a vow at once. He kept his hand on her small palm, feeling the faint life there like an ember. "Who is her mother?" he asked, a voice he barely recognized as his own. The girl's gaze slid to a folded scrap of paper tucked inside the cuff of her dress. With a patience that surprised him, he reached in and unfolded it. The handwriting was looping and hurried, the ink smudged in places where it had been kissed by rain or tears. The paper read, "For Lily. If you find him, tell him I trusted you. Emily." Alexander's throat closed. The name landed like a stone in a pond, sending concentric questions outward. Emily Carter. The woman he had once loved in a season of less ambition and more mistakes. The woman whose memory he had carefully shelved. The woman who, apparently, had trusted him with a promise and then left the world without telling him. Someone had not simply left a picture. Someone had tied the past to the present with a fragile knot. A child, a photograph, a folded note. Outside the humming hospital lights, the city carried on. Traffic, deals, the small indifference of the world. Inside, with a little girl who called him daddy and a scrap of paper that smelled faintly of perfume and regret, Alexander felt the polished floor shift beneath his feet. He had always kept his heart in a locked room. The key had been lost. Tonight, in a hospital that smelled of disinfectant and coffee, a small hand curled around his finger and turned the lock. Hospitals are strange places at dawn. Too bright to feel peaceful, too quiet to feel safe. Alexander Hayes sat in a rigid plastic chair, elbows on his knees, watching Lily breathe beneath the white hospital blanket. Machines blinked in slow rhythms around her. Soft beeps, flashing green lines, the kind of sounds that make grown men confront feelings they swore they buried. Dr. Sarah Monroe stood beside him, arms folded, eyes tired but warm. She had treated enough children to know when one arrived carrying more than physical wounds. "She's stable for now," Sarah said softly, "but dehydration that's severe, it doesn't happen overnight." Alexander nodded, jaw tight. "Meaning someone wasn't taking care of her." "Meaning," Sarah continued, choosing her words carefully, "this little girl has been surviving on her own for longer than a child should." That sentence lodged itself in Alexander's chest like a thorn. Surviving on her own. 7 years old. He glanced down at the folded note he'd found stuffed into Lily's dress. Emily Carter's handwriting still sharp despite the wear. "If you find him, tell him I trusted you." Emily. Emily. Her name had a way of pulling gravity toward it. Sarah's gaze followed his. "You knew her?" Alexander hesitated. He didn't know explanations. He never had, not even to people who had worked for him for years. But something about Sarah's tone, and the tiny girl lying only inches from death, stripped his defenses thinner than he liked. "Years ago," he finally answered. "We were close. Then life happened. Then ambition happened. Then distance, choices, and silence happened. But the truth was heavier, darker, and he wasn't ready to lift it yet." Sarah studied him for a moment, as if mentally piecing him together. "Whatever happened in the past," she said gently, "she trusted you with something important." Her eyes flicked to Lily. Maybe the most important thing in her life. Mark Bennett pushed into the room then, still in his work clothes, smelling faintly of the construction site and adrenaline. He froze when he saw Lily in the hospital bed. "Boss," he whispered. "Is she?" "She's alive," Alexander said curtly. "For now." Mark stepped closer. "Is she? Are you saying she's yours?" The question hung in the air like a gunshot. Alexander didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. He had lived his entire adult life with no ties, no children, no family outside business. And yet here lay a little girl with eyes that held something painfully familiar. "I don't know," he finally said. Sarah stepped forward. "There's a way to know. I've already ordered a DNA test. The lab can rush it." Alexander's chest tightened. "A DNA test. Cold. Clinical. Final." "Do it," he said. A soft whimper broke the silence. Lily stirred under the blanket, her fingers twitching. Her eyelashes fluttered, and her small head turned toward the light. Alexander stood instantly. "Lily!" His voice cracked. Her eyes opened, deeper brown now that the dehydration wasn't clouding them. She blinked up at him, confusion melting slowly into recognition. "Daddy!" she whispered. One word. One tiny, fragile word. And it hit him harder than any financial crash ever had. He sank into the chair beside her, not touching her. Too afraid she would break, but close enough that she could see the answer in his eyes. "I'm here," he whispered. "You're safe." Lily's small fingers reached out. Alexander hesitated only a second before gently taking her hand. Sarah watched them with a mixture of professional calm and quiet awe. Mark looked away, swallowing hope he wouldn't dare voice. Lily's voice was raspy. "Mommy said, if anything happened, I should find you." Alexander stiffened. Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Did Mommy tell you why?" Alexander asked softly. Lily nodded weakly. She said, "You knew the truth." Sarah and Mark exchanged glances. "The truth? What truth?" Alexander swallowed. "What else did she tell you, sweetheart?" Lily blinked slowly. She said, "Don't trust him." Alexander's pulse thudded. "Trust who?" Before she could answer, her small body trembled, exhaustion pulling her under again. Her eyes closed. Alexander leaned back in his chair, breath tight in his chest. "Don't trust him." But who was him? Sarah motioned Alexander into the hallway to give Lily space to rest. "Who was Emily Carter?" she asked simply. Alexander leaned against the wall, staring past the fluorescent lights as memories he'd locked away years ago forced themselves back. "Emily was..." He swallowed. "She was the kindest person I knew. She believed in things I didn't. She wanted a life I didn't think I was ready for." Sarah waited. "I left," he continued. "I told myself she'd be better without me. I didn't know she was pregnant, Sarah. I swear to God I didn't know." Sarah's voice softened. "If she wanted Lily to find you, maybe she never stopped believing in you." That sentence landed deeper than he expected. Mark stepped out of the hospital room then. "Boss," he said quietly, "I checked something." He held up Lily's old photograph, the one she'd clung to. "I found the date printed faintly on the back. It's about 8 years ago. Around the same time you disappeared from the office for a few months. Said you were traveling." Alexander's stomach dropped. He remembered that time. That brief window when he and Emily had been inseparable. That summer he had run from when things felt too real. If Lily was 7. The math didn't lie. But why hadn't Emily told him? Why had she let him go without a word? Unless she wasn't allowed to. A nurse approached holding a small plastic evidence bag. "Mr. Hayes?" This was in Lily's jacket pocket. "We thought you should see it." Alexander took the bag. Inside was a bracelet, a cheap beaded one, but the tiny metal plate attached to it made his blood run cold. It read, "Property of St. Eleanor Family Shelter." Mark frowned. She was living in a shelter? Sarah's eyes widened. "Alexander, that shelter burned down 3 months ago. A lot of kids went missing." Alexander looked at Lily through the glass window. Emily was gone. Lily nearly died. A shelter burned. Patterns began to form, or perhaps warnings. "Someone put her out there," Sarah whispered. "Someone who didn't want her found." Alexander clenched his fists. "So why bring her to the dump site?" Mark lowered his voice. "Boss, what if she wasn't brought there? What if she was running from someone?" Alexander's jaw locked. Behind him, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Hayes, the DNA results are back." The hallway went silent. Sarah looked at him. Mark looked at him. Alexander felt every heartbeat like a countdown. The nurse extended the folder. Alexander opened it. His eyes froze on the result. The folder felt heavier than paper deserves to be. Alexander Hayes held it like a verdict, his thumb worrying the edge as if the motion might change whatever the lab had written in clinical black ink. Behind him, the fluorescent hospital lights hummed on, steady and indifferent. Dr. Sarah Monroe watched him with a look that had grown familiar over the past day. Professional concern tempered by the private knowledge that some problems were not cured with medicine. "You don't have to open it if you're not ready," she said softly. He forced himself to look. He had demanded the test. He had insisted on answers. Now, with the page limp in his hands and the little girl's breath quiet in the next room, the finality of science felt terrifyingly intimate. "Open it," Mark said, voice low. Mark had always been the pragmatic one, foreseeing budgets, schedules, setbacks. He had never been used to waiting for human truths. Alexander unfolded the single sheet. The lab header was sterile, a stamp of authority. His eyes moved down to the result. Paternity, 99.98% probability. Alexander Hayes is the biological father. The room tilted. For a moment he could hear nothing but the old rhythm of the city outside, distant horns fading into a muffled hum. A laugh, half disbelief, half relief, tried to escape him and died like a bird clipped mid-flight. He read the numbers again, as if repetition could make the fact less impossible. Then, instead of triumphant joy, something complicated and raw uncoiled inside him. Guilt, wonder, fear, and an ache he hadn't given himself permission to feel. "Dad," he whispered, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. It rolled around in his mouth like a coin never spent. The sterile sheet seemed suddenly holy. Sarah set a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry if this was difficult." She didn't understand the history, the choices he'd made that had led to this moment. But she understood the gravity. "We'll do everything we can for her." Alexander nodded, throat tight. "Thank you." He thought of Emily's handwriting again. "If you find him, tell him I trusted you." And felt the weight of trust as if it were a physical thing laid at his feet. What he could not forgive himself for, what worried him more than any shareholder's fury, was how seamlessly the life he had built had erased the small, messy, human life that now lay under hospital blankets. He had walked away years ago believing absence would protect them both. Now he had proof that absence had merely become silence, and silence had a price. "Who told you to leave?" Mark asked quietly, not unkindly. "Why did she keep it from you?" Alexander's jaw clenched. The questions were surgical, precise. Answers would need digging he wasn't sure he had the stomach for. "That's what I need to find out," he said. "Everything Emily did had a reason. I have to know why she trusted me and why she thought I would come." That evening, after Lily had rested and the 4 lines hummed quietly, Alexander returned to the small item he'd pocketed from the hospital. A scrap of paper Emily had tucked into Lily's dress. He smoothed the creases with deliberate care. There was nothing more personal than handwriting. You could read the tilt of someone's days in their loops and the pressure of their pen. "Protect her. If anything happens to me, tell him where she is. Tell him everything. E." He had held onto the note as if it might guide him. Now, with the paternity confirmed, the instruction felt less like suggestion and more like a command from the past. He would be a father biologically, legally, morally, and Emily's last act had been placing a child into his hands with faith as currency. He found his phone and typed 1 line into a message to Claire, his fiancée, then deleted it. His life was not a single track anymore. It was a forked highway with a child in the middle and obligations in every lane. He was used to making decisions that affected trustees and investors. Making a choice that hinged on the fragile heartbeat of a 7-year-old was different. He swallowed hard and typed again. "She's my daughter. I'm staying with her tonight." The reply he received 30 seconds later was both a relief and another test. "I'm on my way. Stay where you are. Don't let anyone in who seems suspicious." Alexander stared at the words. Who would be suspicious? Why was there a need for caution beyond the basics of hospital privacy? Mark had not been idle. While Alexander wrestled with the emotional verdict, Mark had followed up on the small clues. The bracelet that read St. Eleanor Family Shelter. The faint date on Lily's photograph. He returned with a printed article, edges still warm from the office printer. 3 months ago, Mark said, pointing at the headline, St. Eleanor burned down in a late-night fire. Arson was suspected. Several kids were reported missing afterward. The case was cold. Poor community, less attention. Sarah leaned over the article. You're telling me Lily was from a shelter that burned, and someone thought she should be left at a dump site? He had to have planned something, Mark murmured. You don't just walk a kid to a dump site and hope she'll be found by a billionaire. That's not a gamble. That's a message. Alexander's mind clicked into inventory mode despite himself. Who would send a message like that? Who would want to shake him from his life with a child at his feet? If Emily had been running from someone, had she thought leaving Lily with him would give the child safety? Or had she been desperate enough to believe any connection to Alexander could become a shield? He pictured Emily running through rain, clutching Lily close and whispering a name in the dark. He imagined a hand, gentle or cruel, pressing a photograph into a child's palm and telling her a lie that was actually a route to salvation. The image made his chest ache. That night, after Claire had taken Lily home under the watchful eye of a nurse and Mark had played bodyguard to the car, an unfamiliar man showed up at the hospital entrance. He was unremarkable in most ways. Jeans, a baseball cap pulled low, but he carried an intensity that made security do what security does best. Notice. Mark watched the man on the CCTV feed and frowned. The stranger paced outside the sliding glass doors, glancing up at cameras like someone who'd been taught to read them. Then, after a long minute, he moved on. Mark called security and filed a report. Probably a reporter, security told them. They follow anything with a billionaire and a child. But the man didn't carry a camera. He carried a small black notebook, the kind people keep for names and numbers. His glances were quick and assessing. Not the hungry stare of a journalist, but the measuring look of someone cataloging assets. Alexander thought of the note. Don't trust him. He thought of Emily's warning. His fingers tightened on the notebook in his pocket. Who was watching Lily? Reporter, Snoop, or something darker? In the quiet of the early morning, Alexander returned alone to the slum where Emily had lived years ago. The walls were scrawled with faded graffiti, and the air smelled of fried food and old rain. He stood in the doorway of the apartment he hadn't seen since he left. There, in a crack in the floorboard where he had once hidden a cheap cigarette pack, he found something he did not expect. A Polaroid, face up, the same young Alexander smiling on a stoop, the very photograph Lily had clutched. On the back was a scribble he recognized at once. The looping handwriting he had read the night in the hospital. If anything happens to me, protect her. Someone had kept that Polaroid all these years. Someone had held it until the ink faded and the edges curled. The proof that he had been part of their life, no matter how briefly, sat in his palm like a concession. He sat on the curb and let the city press against him. The hum of late-night buses, the distant laughter of people who didn't know his name. For the first time since he had chosen a razor-edge life of deals and deadlines, Alexander felt truly exposed. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. We need to talk. You've been asleep for too long. Someone who kept a promise. The message had no signature. Car engine idled nearby. A shadow passed his apartment window. He looked up, heart suddenly very loud. Someone had been waiting for him to find that Polaroid. Someone had wanted him to know. And someone, unknown, unnamed, had just told him, in the quiet way the world sometimes speaks, that the past was not finished with him. Morning scraped across the skyline like a cautious apology as Alexander Hayes stepped back into the hospital with a determination that surprised even him. Everything in his life had once revolved around control, deadlines, profit margins, measurable outcomes. Now his entire world revolved around a 7-year-old girl sleeping under soft hospital lighting, attached to monitors that made his heart lurch with every beep. He paused outside Lily's room. She was awake. Her tiny fingers toyed with the teddy bear Claire had brought. Her feet swung gently off the edge of the bed, dangling like little pendulums. When she looked up and saw him, her face lit in a small, fragile smile. "Daddy!" Alexander cleared his throat, because something in his chest threatened to crack completely. He crossed the room and knelt beside her. "Hey, sweetheart," he murmured. "How do you feel today?" "Warm," she whispered. "Safe." 2 words. 2 words that rewrote everything he had believed about himself. He brushed a stray curl from her forehead. "Good. And you're going to stay safe, okay? I promise." But as he said the words, the hospital lights flickered. Just once, but enough to make him glance toward the hall. Enough to remind him of the message he'd received last night. "You've been asleep for too long." Before Lily could speak again, Dr. Sarah Monroe stepped inside with a clipboard, her expression thoughtful. "Good news," she announced. "Her fluid levels are stabilizing. She's still severely underweight, but with rest and proper meals, she'll get better." "And after that?" Alexander asked. "Where does she go?" Sarah paused. "Well, she has no guardian on record, no next of kin. Given the DNA results," she looked at him carefully. "Alexander, she's your daughter. Legally, temporarily, or permanently, that's up to you to decide." Lily turned her face toward him, eyes wide with a hope so bright it made him swallow hard. "I'm not letting her go," he said. "Not to anyone." Sarah gave a small nod. "Then we'll prepare the paperwork." But paperwork wasn't the problem now. Someone out there had chased this child out of a shelter that later burned. Someone had walked the corridors last night watching the doors. Someone had her photograph, the one she carried, and had kept it before giving it to her. And someone had sent Alexander a message. "We need to talk." Mark Bennett appeared in the doorway, tension radiating from his shoulders. "Alex, we've got a situation." He stepped aside then, and 2 security officers entered with a man between them, the same man who'd been pacing outside the hospital last night. Baseball cap, jeans, unshaven face, narrow eyes that darted everywhere but Alexander's. "Found him trying to get into the pediatric wing," the guard said. "No visitor pass." Alexander tensed, instinct flaring like a match. "Who are you?" he demanded. I'm not here for trouble," the man stammered. "I'm here for her." Every muscle in Alexander's body locked. "For Lily." "Yes." Mark moved closer. Sarah stood protectively beside Lily's bed. Alexander stepped forward, jaw tight. "And why?" Alexander asked slowly. "Would you be looking for my daughter?" The man swallowed visibly, sweat beading at his temple. "I worked at the shelter. St. Eleanor. I knew her mother. I knew Emily." That name hung in the air again like smoke. Security searched him. No weapons. No wallet. No phone. Just a badge from St. Eleanor that was half melted along the edge, as if it had been in the fire. "Why were you trying to reach Lily?" Sarah asked cautiously. The man's eyes filled with something unexpected sorrow. "I wanted to make sure she wasn't alone," he said. "Before the fire, Emily told me if anything happened to her, I should keep watch. But when the fire happened and everyone ran, I lost them. I lost everyone." Alexander felt a strange twist of pity, even through the suspicion. "What about the message?" he asked sharply. "The text I received." The man shook his head. I didn't send any text. Mark's eyes narrowed. Security exchanged glances. Then who did? Mark muttered. The man's breath hitched. Someone else was watching Emily. Someone who wanted Lily. I don't know who. But I think the fire wasn't an accident. His voice cracked on that last word. Sarah's hand tightened around her clipboard. Mark swore under his breath. But Alexander, he heard only one thing. Someone wanted Lily. Take him downstairs, Alexander ordered the guards. Verify everything. Do not let him leave the building. When the man was escorted away, Alexander turned to Lily, who sat trembling, clutching her teddy bear. Daddy! He swung her gently into his arms before she could shake any more. She melted into him like a child who had been waiting years for someone solid enough to hold her pain. You're safe, he murmured into her hair. No one is taking you. Not now. Not ever. Lily sniffed softly. Mommy used to say, monsters hide in the nicest clothes. The words froze Alexander's blood. Sweetheart, he whispered. What monsters? Before she could answer, the hospital intercom crackled overhead. Code yellow. Unidentified visitor on the pediatric floor. All staff be alert. Sarah's head snapped up. Someone else is here. Mark ran to the hall. Alexander shielded Lily with his body, ready to face whatever stepped around the corner. But no one came. Only the intercom again. Code yellow resolved. Sarah exhaled shakily. False alarm, I hope. But Alexander knew better. Someone was testing the hospital. Someone wanted to know where Lily was. Someone was willing to try twice in 24 hours. That afternoon, after security tightened the entire floor, a nurse brought in a sealed envelope. Delivery for Mr. Hayes. Alexander frowned. From who? No signature. Just dropped off at the front desk. He took the envelope, feeling immediately that something was wrong. The paper smelled faintly of smoke, that same acrid scent he remembered from St. Eleanor's fire report. He tore it open. Inside was a single photograph, a recent one. Lily, from 2 nights before. She was standing inside the shelter, clutching the same teddy bear, staring at a door behind her. A door slightly ajar. A man's silhouette visible just beyond it. A man Alexander recognized, not immediately, but slowly, painfully, like a nightmare sharpening into focus. Sarah peered over his shoulder. Alex? Who is that? Alexander's voice dropped into a whisper. I haven't seen him in years. Mark's eyes widened. You know him? Alexander nodded. He used to work for my company. I fired him after an incident. He swallowed hard. A dangerous one. But that wasn't the worst part. On the back of the photograph, written in jagged handwriting, were 5 words that turned Alexander cold. Fathers don't run forever, Alex. Sarah stepped backward. Mark cursed under his breath. Lily looked up at him, sensing tension. Daddy? What's wrong? Alexander didn't answer, because suddenly, everything made sense. Emily hadn't been running from some faceless danger. She had been running from a man Alexander once knew. A man he had underestimated. A man with a grudge. A man with a motive. And now, that man knew exactly where Lily was. The rain had slowed to a faint drizzle when Alexander stepped back into Lily's hospital room. The world felt quieter now, as if the chaos of the past 24 hours had finally begun to settle. Lily slept curled under her blanket, one tiny hand resting on the teddy bear Claire bought her, the other gripping the edge of Alexander's shirt as though terrified he would disappear if she let go. He wouldn't. Not ever again. Dr. Sarah Monroe entered softly, her expression gentle. Security just confirmed, she said in a low voice. Ethan Cole is in police custody. He'll be transferred to county jail in the morning. Alexander nodded but didn't look away from Lily. What happens next? Sarah asked. Alexander finally turned to her. His voice, though quiet, held a strength that hadn't existed before. What happens next is simple, he said. She goes home with me. Sarah nodded, touched by the conviction in his tone. She deserves a safe home. And she'll have one. Mark entered next, carrying a sealed file. Alex, it's from the detectives. They want you to see something. Inside was the address he'd found, the one Ethan had taunted him with. But now the detectives had included a short report. Alexander read the summary slowly. It wasn't a dangerous place. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't an enemy's house. It was a small rented room Emily had kept secretly for 7 years, paid in cash under a different name. Sarah tilted her head. Why would she keep that hidden? Alexander exhaled, the answer arriving in a soft wave of understanding. Because she didn't want Lily growing up in the shelter, he whispered. She wanted a backup plan, private place, a safe place. And the truth she wanted you to find there? Sarah asked. Alexander didn't respond with words. He left the hospital, drove through the fog-soaked streets, and stopped at the small house on Green Hill Lane. Inside, the caretaker handed him a box. Emily's box, her handwriting on the lid. He took a breath and opened it. Inside were Lily's baby bracelet, photos of Emily holding a newborn, a faded letter, and something that made Alexander's hand shake. His name written on hospital paperwork, listed as Lily's father. Emily had written a note on the back. Alexander, I never wanted you to feel trapped. I never wanted you to think I was using you. I just wanted Lily to have a chance at life. If you ever find this, it means you're ready to know you were always her father. And she always deserved you. Please forgive me. Emily. The room felt smaller as the tears finally came. Uninvited, unfamiliar, unstoppable. Years of success, ambition, and distance melted in seconds. He whispered into the quiet room, I forgive you, and I'll take care of her. I promise. Back at the hospital. When he returned, Lily woke up slowly, blinking under the soft hospital lights. Daddy? She whispered. This time he didn't hesitate. I'm right here. She reached up, touching his cheek with small fingers. Mommy said you'd come one day. He swallowed hard. I'm sorry I took so long. It's okay, she said. You're here now. Those 3 words, simple, innocent, forgiving, became the first building blocks of a new life neither of them expected but both desperately needed. Dr. Sarah handed Alexander a stack of temporary custody papers. This is just the beginning, she said warmly. But something tells me you two are going to be just fine. At the exit, Mark waited with a warm coat for Lily and a proud grin for Alexander. You okay, boss? He asked. Alexander looked down at Lily, whose hand was wrapped tightly around his own. For the first time in a long time, he said, voice thick with emotion, I am. They stepped outside together, into fresh air, into morning light, into a future Emily would have been proud of. Alexander lifted Lily gently into his arms. Where are we going? She asked. Home, he said, then added softly, to our home. She smiled, small, sleepy, and perfect. And as he carried her toward the waiting car, Alexander Hayes understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't a rescue story. This wasn't a miracle. This was a second chance, the greatest one he would ever receive. Thanks for staying to the end. If you want more stories like this,
subscribe for more echoes.
Hit the subscribe button and join our family.